Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to in another of research seminars in the series of research seminars from the Center for Protecting Women Online. I'm Olga Jurasz. I'm director of the center, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Yimin Chen from the School of Computing Technologies at RMIT in Australia. Welcome, Yimin. And Yimin will be presenting today on his most recent research in the course. As always, there'll be time for questions after your presentation.
Lovely, thanks very much. Let's get this started. Okay, can you all see the screen okay? All right, well, thank you very much for having me here. My name is Yimin Chen. I am a lecturer at RMIT University in the discipline of interaction, technology, and information. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I'm so thankful to be at the Open University and with all of you online. So my academic background here is in library and information sciences, and much of my work has focused on human-computer interaction and information behavior. So basically, I'm interested in what happens when you put devices, data, and people together and give it a bit of a mix. My PhD research was about trying to understand internet trolling, or at least the version of trolling that existed sometime before 2016, which I guess sort of seemed, I don't know, slightly less aggressively terrible. Maybe it was a simpler time. I've also worked on projects aimed at detecting and countering misinformation, disinformation, and in recent years, trying to figure out technological and social interventions to prevent and mitigate tech-facilitated sexual violence and online abuse. And it's from that stream of research that I am going to be talking to you all here today. What this talk is about really is an idea that was developed from a number of conversations that I've had in the past year with my colleague at RMIT, Dana Mackay. So this idea is perhaps not fully 100% quite totally formed yet, but we chose this sort of intentionally provocative title because we hope to encourage a bit more discussion about this topic, and I hope that we can have some conversation at the end today as well. So in February of 2016, the pseudonymous British poet Brian Bilston posted a poem entitled "America is a Gun" to Twitter. In this poem, Bilston lists symbols of various countries in simple rhyming quatrains, but ending always with this rhyme break. He says, "England is a cup of tea, France a wheel of ripened brie, Greece a short, squat olive tree. America is a gun. Brazil is football on the sand, Argentina, Maradona's hand, Germany, an Oompa band. America is a gun. Holland is a wooden shoe, Hungary, a goulash stew, Australia, a kangaroo. America is a gun. Japan is a thermal spring, Scotland, a Highland fling. Oh, better to be anything than America as a gun. So the inspiration for this poem, according to Bilston, was a tweet by then Florida governor and presidential hopeful Jeb Bush, shown on the side here, where he posted a photo of a handgun engraved with his name and the caption, America. Just days after this poem was posted, there was a mass shooting in Kansas. And just a few months after that, the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida became the deadliest mass shooting event in US history, at least at the time. And over the years, Bilson's poem has been shared countless times on social media to mark the occurrence of mass shootings in the United States as commentary on that nation's firearm obsession. Of course, one might be able to criticize this poem for being overly simplistic. You can point out that there are many positive symbols that could have been used to also represent America. And there's also the fact that many of these other countries have shameful aspects to their cultures and their histories as well. But of course, the purpose of Bilson's poem is not to make a comprehensive accounting of all a country's virtues and vices, but to forcefully draw our focus on one urgent problem: the danger of gun violence in the United States. So similarly, our purpose with this paper is not to claim that you can shoot somebody with information, literally, but it is to draw focus on an urgent problem that we see about how many of us think about information. And it is this often unquestioned assumption that the more information, the freer the information, better. So what does it mean for information to be a gun? Let me unpack this metaphor a little bit. So members of the National Rifle Association and gun rights activists in America will often tell you that guns are just tools. They'll say that, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And this, of course, is a banal truism. But the reason they keep saying this is to obscure and to minimize the role that guns play in perpetrating interpersonal violence. And furthermore, certain design features of firearms, such as semi-automatic firing mechanisms and high-capacity magazines, can enable faster delivery of more bullets and therefore can amplify the capacity for greater and more serious harm in any situation where they are involved. Basically, the existence of these sorts of guns makes the world less safe. Now, similarly, we argue that the design of consumer information technology and the datafication, the sort of transformation of every aspect of our everyday lives into information and data through things like social media platforms, mobile apps, wearable devices, and smart home appliances. This enables the collection, the collation, and the delivery of data at rates and scales we've never seen before. And while there may be legitimate uses for all this information, just as there may possibly be legitimate uses for all these guns, the abundance and the accessibility of sensitive and personal data nevertheless facilitates, and we'd argue even encourages, abuse. And as well, it can amplify the potential harms and consequences of misuse. We contend basically that the world is less safe because some of these data exist. So what I mean when I say information facilitated interpersonal harms, well, in computing disciplines, in science and technology studies, there is this notion of socio-technical harm, which entangle the relationships between design decisions, cultural norms, and power dynamics in the context of digital technologies. And so according to Shelby et al. 23, interpersonal harms are those socio-technical harms which, quote, adversely shape relations between people and communities. So this could take the form of things like technology-facilitated violence. So examples include coercive control, online abuse, or sexual harassment. This could be things like behavioral exploitation, which may take the form of emotional manipulation or threats to reputational harms. And then there's the invasion of privacy, with things like surveillance, non-consensual data collection, and identity theft. So our argument here is that the information gathered, processed, and surfaced through so many of these everyday digital technologies, through their most basic functionality, this information can be abused by one person in order to enact harm upon another. But the sort of second, more concerning part of our argument is the fact that this sort of information can often push people towards more harmful behaviors simply by its existence. This information creates opportunities for harm where none existed before. So in some of the academic literature, we do find some examples, some studies of the weaponization of information. We have examples here from fields as different as criminology, cybersecurity, human-computer action, public policy, and even nursing. So we find studies about things like stalkerware, right? These are apps or tools that are used for covert surveillance and tracking. And very often these are explicitly designed and marketed for basically nefarious purposes. There's no real good sort of pro-social use for many of these things. And not only can abusers use this technology to track where someone is and what they're doing, but many of these tools also allow access to private data like photos and passwords. There's also studies about weaponization of the Internet of Things. So these are web-enabled appliances like doorbells, fitness trackers, thermostats, things like that. And all of these devices collect a ton of information pretty much constantly. And sure, some may have plausible use cases, but for example, why on earth would you need your toaster to be connected to Wi-Fi? Those exist. And very often these Internet of Things devices have quite poor security. And so they can be abusable for recording, tracking people, and even for direct harassment via turning them on or off or changing settings remotely. And finally, we have a category of parental monitoring. And so, again, these are things like tracking apps, home cameras, and baby monitors. And, at its core, this is the same technology as stalkerware, but, well, it is more socially acceptable because it's for the safety of kids, right? And just like stalkerware, these apps and devices can be used and abused in harmful ways. But again, what we find more concerning are the social and the moral obligations that things like these child monitoring technologies can impose on parents and family members, right? So, shouldn't you do everything in your power to make sure that your child is safe? Are you a bad parent if you don't know where your child is at every single moment during the day? And, if you have the means of tracking their location in case they get kidnapped, well, does that not mean that you probably should? In most of these cases, and for most of these technologies, the information, the data that they provide to us is their selling point. And of course, the more data available, the better. We, often use these things because we want to track some of these data points. I wear a Fitbit. It tracks my heart rate. We want to track our children, our loved ones and partners. And, when you look at these different categories of devices, well, stalkerware is obviously unequivocally bad. But all these other technologies, Internet of Things, the parental monitoring apps, at their core, again, they basically just do the same thing, but for a different sort of marketed purpose. And so much abusive interpersonal behavior is very often situated in a narrative of care, right? I'm doing these things because I'm worried about you, because I'm thinking about you, because I only have your best interest at heart, and why can't you see that? But the way these things work and the type and the amount of data that they make available leads us to question, when does an acceptable level of concern cross over to unacceptable levels of control? And what we argue is that all of this tech is pushing us in the wrong direction. And part of the problem is because so much of this, again, is so normalized. Tracking and measuring data is just something that we expect in our everyday lives. So, for example, on the left here, when the eccentric biohacking rich guy, Brian Johnson, posted ridiculous personal details about his girlfriend earlier this year, well, if we had seen it, most of us probably cringed. But it's probably not because of the fact that he's just tracking bio data in general, in the abstract. It's probably mostly because he was posting publicly about her privates. So, as a society, we have already sort of come on board with this idea that tracking and measuring everything that you possibly can is normal and even desirable. There was a recent survey in Australia that found that 1 in 5 young people under 24 believe that it is okay to track their partner whenever they want to. And these sort of friend finder tracking apps are also extremely common among teenagers. And further research from Griffith University in Australia also suggests that this mindset, this acceptance of tracking, is developed from childhood through, again, things like parental monitoring apps. And even, seemingly benign things like these transaction notifications that you can get from your banking app can create problems. So one of the seeds that germinated the idea for this piece was when my co-author, Dana, noticed that she would get push notifications on her phone whenever her husband used their shared credit card. She found that she could basically surveil his actions and his movements during the day without even trying. Now, of course, this feature is supposed to help protect us against fraud and theft, but the timestamps and location information and the spending amounts that come out on these notifications, they're there to help you determine whether a transaction is legitimate or not. But again, they also reveal your partner's potential movements and activities. And of course, for more creative abusers, bank transfers have also been used as a means of harassment because even if an abuser is blocked on all other digital and social media platforms, well, they can still send threatening messages through their banking app by just transferring 1 penny to their target. Now, as I said, my sort of home discipline is in library and information science. And both professionally and academically, many of us, like information people, have traditionally been, I think, pretty great at pushing back against institutional and systemic informational injustices. So, for example, when the United States Patriot Act and the National Security Agency threaten the intellectual freedom and the privacy of library users, we were there to protest. When Mark Zuckerberg pulled all sorts of shady shenanigans with our social media data, we were there to protest as well. And when Elon Musk created Mecha Hitler, well, we were there to protest that too. And, a lot of public sentiment supported these protests. However, when it comes to the role that information plays in the perpetration of interpersonal harms, sort of one-to-one or one-to-few or few-to-one, as opposed to these, big organizations against the public, many of us seem to have a bit of a blind spot to interpersonal. But why? So here's one possible explanation for this kind of blind spot. I'm sure you all know about the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution up at the top here, which reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And that Second Amendment has often been interpreted by gun rights activists as, well, enshrining effectively a nigh endless, natural, God-given right to gun ownership. Well, in the library and information world, we kind of have a version of this as well. So in the middle here is the first formal statement on the principles of access to information and freedom of expression, published in 1997 by IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations. And this reads, "In order to promote the spread of knowledge, education, and culture to all nations throughout the world, it is essential that all forms of information shall be allowed to flow freely." And on the bottom here, we have one of the sort of core ideals that has driven much of the early development of digital and online technologies. And this is attributed to Stewart Brand, the idea that, quote, "all information wants to be free." And it is this sort of kind of techno-libertarianist philosophy that imagines all people, all users of this information as rational, reasonable agents of their own self-interest. And of course, it's not usually in anyone's self-interest to commit harms to others. But, looking at some of these statements, I can't help but notice striking similarities between the proclamations here. So, in much the same way that many gun owners feel entitled to their firearms because they consider themselves to be responsible users, so many of us may often feel that we are entitled to access and to use information without infringement because we ourselves are responsible, rational, reasonable users. And just as gun control legislation has focused on, well, controlling guns as a way of reducing gun violence, well, perhaps we should think seriously about whether or not all forms of information should be allowed to flow freely. And on that note, if you'll indulge me, I would like to share a quick personal anecdote about sort of freedom of information access. So back in the year 2020, I was teaching a research methods course for our Masters of Library and Information Science students, when, for reasons, we suddenly had to pivot to online. And one thing I did to sort of cope during that time was to create a few internet memes about grad school, like the one shown here. But I also had to figure out basically what to do, how to get my students to do observational research practice when, well, all the physical spaces were empty and no one was allowed anywhere near each other. So taking inspiration from an old New York Times article about customer profiling and tracking, I decided that an exercise about investigating digital trace data would be kind of fun. And, to sort of get around the of having my students spy on other people, I thought it would be a good idea to offer up myself as a subject. I thought I had done a good job Googling myself at the time, but, well, the assignment I came up with was this. I told my students basically that I'm asking you to apply the observational and the trace evidence concepts from class to see what you can learn about a person based on their digital footprint. So specifically, I want them to try to find as much publicly available information as they can about me. They were to think about the different ways that you can uncover and access information about a person without doing anything, too shady or too illegal, and then to see what sorts of things they could find. Their sort of deliverable was to compile a personal dossier or sort of a report detailing what they found about me. Now, again, I thought I had done a decent job of Googling myself, of doing a digital audit of my online footprint. I thought I knew what was out there and what my students would be able to find. I thought this would just be a fun, creative way to combine learning about research methods and research ethics. And at least on that last part, I was correct. But I definitely underestimated the ingenuity and the persistence of my students when it came to, well, basically cyber stalking. So this is just one of the creative assignments that I got back. And I'm still not entirely sure where they got that picture from. I ran this sort of research exercise in 3 consecutive semesters of this course, and every single time, my students dug up something that I hadn't anticipated. So one found my name in an old course website from when I was an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia. Several of them found an embarrassing old LiveJournal account that I had completely forgotten existed. And from some of the entries there, they were able to deduce the approximate location of my old childhood home. And some, even took the time and effort to dig through pages and pages of my old Reddit posts. And, perhaps I should have known better. As someone who's been online for a very long time and who, grew up with and on the internet, I had forgotten about many of these things, that they existed at all. But, the internet, as they say, never forgets. Now, I don't teach that course anymore, and I haven't done this exercise in a few years, but, if I were to bring it back, it would need a bit of a redesign because I tried this again recently and found that Google will now basically do all of the work for you automatically. So this was a recent search based on the name I had used for my old Twitter handle. Now, of course, this information isn't entirely accurate or up to date or comprehensive, but it is a great starting point for anyone who wants to cyberstalk you. And in fact, with AI overviews like this routinely offered up in your search results, well, people can accidentally, inadvertently cyberstalk you even if they have no real intention of doing so, even if they don't actually want to do so. So our argument here, information like this creates opportunities for antisocial and potentially harmful behavior, not only because it exists somewhere out there, but also because it's more and more, it is being pushed at us, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not. And not just at us, it is being pushed at, the broad us, all the people out there. And I think at the moment, especially in a lot of the academic disciplines, especially in my academic discipline of information science, we don't as yet quite appreciate how bad some of these things have gotten, how potentially harmful some of these things can be. And, it feels as if a lot of people still kind of are operating under, this assumption that information doesn't kill people, people kill people. So this is our piece. This is, our attempt at trying to engage some more discussion and conversation about this issue, this topic. The QR code and the link there is to an earlier version of this paper that we presented at the Information Seeking in Context conference earlier this year in Montreal. And I would be more than happy to take questions, have conversation, and talk to you more about some of these issues.
Thank you so much, Yimin. That was a fascinating talk, and I know, speaking both to you and Dana previously, I know how this research was coming about. But here at the center, we also talk a lot about online harms, interpersonal harms, and also how far how far impact of online harms also reaches. And I think, as you kind of acknowledged in your talk as well, the picture is getting a bit more complex, and things, are getting worse, unfortunately, with the use of other tools, also facilitated by AI. I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, conversation. If there are any questions or comments, please just raise your hand if you would like to speak. I'm also going to check the Q&A. You can post or you can speak if you like.
So in the Q&A, I see one from Angel.
Yep.
Should I just
Hopefully.
take that? So it says here, what type of prompts does AI need to cyberstalk you? For example, is it just looking at your name, or are specific instructions given? So in my case, I did not expect that AI summary to come up. All I did was search my old Twitter handle. That was it entirely. Just Google search, shiny pants 0, and it just automatically came up with all of that about, well, linked specifically to me, and a bunch of basically every other time where I have used that handle or that's applied, that was, applied online, different websites and different documents and so on. So no specific prompts or instructions, just so part of my argument here is that even just plain generic everyday use of many of these technologies through our personal digital history and our current just Googling things around will surface a lot of sort of unintended information that, whether or not it's necessarily private, quote unquote, it is something that you don't expect people to just be given, and faced with, whether or not they want it or not, whether or not they're looking for it or not.
Thank you. And I think we've got another question. Well, Angel said crazy and scary. I guess that's a fair summary. A question from Paula. What is the concept of info you use in your work? It seems to be used as a synonym of private data.
Yeah, so we're using this term kind of broadly, and it's not just to refer to private data. So like the example I gave about all this unexpected information that came up through just a Google search and now the AI-powered Google search. A lot of it is not necessarily like private in the sense that, you know, your banking details, your personal health information, or, you know, all these sorts of things that may be more like secret information, but just information about you broadly, information that you generate and create just by being alive and interacting with the world, right? So again, with things like mobile and digital banking apps, like tapping on, tapping off to you know, transit is very you know, easy, efficient. I love it, but it does leave a trail. And again, many of these things are not very well secured, and they are uh, findable. But even if you argue that could be, you know, considered under the realm of private data, things like, you know, I remember when timestamps and sort of red notifications appeared on messaging apps, right? And there was, again, this sort of reaction about, you know, do we need to know whether or not you've been, you know, left on red, and what sort of social implications does that carry? So yes, we are talking about the risks of private data, but just all data in general that is attached to you, related to you, about your actions, your sort of being in the world, could potentially, again, trigger some of these, I guess, negative spirals towards, you know, distrust, bad feelings, and then perhaps onto more sort of active harms.
Thanks, Yimin. I actually had a question about, it's more out of curiosity, whether in your research and in your conversations, both you and Dana thought about the implications of that research for any regulatory action, or how would this potentially resonate with regulation that we see arising in this online context? If it's too early, please feel free to say so. I'm just always curious as we see that regulation coming
Right,
at
yeah.
us, both in terms of data and privacy, although not always in the context that you spoke about. I'm always curious about, you know, what would you see as next steps in terms of regulation of that space?
Well, so one thing Dana and I don't, well, one thing Dana is interested in, and I'm not sure I agree with her on this, is applications of things like automation and sort of big data patterns on social media platforms. One thing Dana is interested in exploring is, you know, whether we can get, say, Facebook or Instagram to be able to detect when people are engaging in sort of potentially concerning kind of stalking, cyber stalking behavior, right? So if you're on someone's profile and you scroll through like 5 years of their, you know, posts and their photographs, that could, you know, it could potentially trigger a flag or a little pop-up saying, you know, what you're doing seems consistent with stuff that could lead to a bad place. Um, are you okay? You know, do you need to talk to somebody? And, you know, I'm not exactly sure how serious Dana is about actually implementing something like this, but it's something that she talks about quite often. And that, again, part of the issue I have with it is like trying to address these sort of social, cultural, behavioral knock-on effects of availability of data and access to data by by more surveillance, essentially, doesn't quite sit right with me. But I guess broadly, one of the the questions, the problems we're sort of grappling with here is that, you know, how do we contain it? How do we fight it? Like in a way that the genie, as you say, is out of the bottle. It's already everywhere. Do we, I guess one thing regulation can do is to, legally put a stop to some of these types of data collection and at least limit the, well, sorry, backtrack a little bit. One thing we're actually both interested in is this concept of safety by design, right? So instead of move fast, break things, collect all the data, and then give it to your users because, of course, your users love more data. Well, for tech designers, maybe it's better to think first about whether or not you should and not whether or not you could. And I'm sure there are, legal and regulatory sort of policies that can be put in place to promote that kind of behavior rather than, break everything.
Absolutely. And I absolutely agree with what you said. And I think a part of that, and that maybe doesn't help particularly, is the fact that I think as a society we have normalized that kind of commonality of measuring and tracking and that information being readily available. I think you quoted an example of push notification whenever a transaction on a joint account is being made, which I think we don't notice until we kind of stop and really think about it and whether we even wanted to receive that information. There is another question from Laiba. I hope I pronounce your name right. A criminology undergrad from Pakistan. And the question is, as Pakistan continues to shape its internet laws and digital governance frameworks, what measures should be prioritized to ensure a safer and more inclusive online environment for girls and women? I think you started perhaps to answer that, but I'm not sure if you want to build on it.
Yeah. So again, I do think this idea of safety by design is absolutely something that should be integral to all these processes, right? Again, not, encouraging people to design all of these new features, these new dashboards, all this data you can track just because you can, and because, the companies are collecting it anyway, but to, do some perhaps user consultations, some legal consultations to run through some scenarios, think about, well, what are sort of the costs and benefits of having this information, both, creating it in the first place, collecting it in the first place, and also then making it available in whichever way you deem, is, I guess, commercializable. At the same time, so like going back to some of these ideas and perhaps maybe stretching this metaphor of the gun a bit too far. Again, one of the things we're grappling with here is this idea that in order to, say, effectively prevent, mitigate, detect abusive behavior against women and girls online, well, we need to collect data about who's doing it. We need to establish, evidence that this is happening. We need to identify who is doing these things, and in some way, this metaphor is that the only way to stop the bad guy with the gun or the bad guy with the information is with a good guy with the information. And with guns, that that argument has never sat well with me, and at least I'm trying to grapple right now with whether or not it makes sense in the informational sense there as well.
Thank you. There are still a couple more questions, and there's a comment from Leanne, which I'm going to read. Just a comment to your point early on that access to this information can itself encourage bad behaviors. I didn't take that too seriously at first, but seeing AI offer up that much information on a person made me, a reasonably stable and emotionally intelligent person, think about what I could learn about people from my past I haven't otherwise thought about. I'm so used to thinking of myself as the agent when using technology, but that's clearly shifting more than I realized, which I think is a very nice comment to kind of summarize what you were also sharing. Okay, the next one is from Alba. I wonder if this information ever disappears. For instance, let's say that you try to delete the account by asking X or applying the right to erasure. Would this be effective?
Well, maybe, but I think you run into difficulties with jurisdiction, right? All these platforms are multinational and international, and some of the things like so the GDRP and things like the right to forgetting law, something like that, right? In Europe may protect your information in Europe, but they don't always have the force to reach across to the United States, to other parts of the world, and um, at least in my own personal life, like I mentioned, there's that old LiveJournal account that has a couple embarrassing things, but also some like pretty specific personal details from my past. Um, I have thought about, perhaps getting that close, but it's so old. I don't remember any of the passwords. I don't remember any of the, identity verification or the recovery emails or anything related to essentially, prove that it was my account and that I would like it scrubbed or shut off. So especially for, I guess, those of us who've been on the internet for longer, or even people who have an automatic uh, the password manager and you just forget your passwords. I know Olga mentioned this. Like if you lose your access, then you have very few ways of getting something removed, right? Even if it may potentially affect you, and you may have to go to the courts or something like that. I'm not really sure. It is like an open question, I think.
Thank you. And there is a question from Rita. Are you by chance aware if there are any running active research to help address the looming dangers in the information science space? If yes, could you talk about it a bit? Thank you.
Okay. I'm assuming you're referencing sort of the looming dangers about information that I sort of called out as a blind spot. So there are, projects, often small projects all around the world. RMIT, we have, as you might expect, some uh, fairly preliminary projects looking into this. But in talking with other people in the information science space, it seems to me that one of the problems is not that this research doesn't necessarily exist. It's that because information science is kind of multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary, a lot of this work gets published in other fields. And this is something I've noticed I'm kind of guilty of myself, because some of the work I've done on like technology facilitated sexual violence is not published in an information science journal. I published it in like violence against women journals, or other gender um, and masculinity journals. So one of the, I think, interesting things I want to look into in the future about this is to, well, first try to verify if this is actually true, if information science scholars and professionals are doing this work, but just publicizing and publishing it in somewhere else, and how to basically bring it back in, because I think there is a benefit to talk about these things within the information science kind of framework, and to try to understand the role that information itself plays in being able to facilitate and perhaps, again, even encourage some of these harmful behaviors.
Thank you. I think people are intrigued about next steps, so please bear with me with the next question. What's your next step for future work? I think you started to talk about it already.
Yeah.
Do you have suggestions to researchers, for example, which questions to ask, address, or users in increasingly normalization of data collection? So I think it's coming back to the point about normalization of data collection and kind of a research perspective on it.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I think, already existing research about datafication. Basically, again, this trend where we try to collect data about or turn everything about our lives into data and then put it on a dashboard so we can monitor it, find trends, and somehow use that information. Maybe slightly away from the online harms, space. One thing I think would be really interesting to look at is, examine some of these features that are widely available on things like Fitbits, on, your phone apps, health tracking, all these sorts of things, and try to identify, what sort of the core features are that, this service or this app needs to function, that what is valuable about it to the people using it, and what is just other data that is on the dashboard because it's there and it costs the company almost nothing to put it up there, but could then potentially create social and behavioral implications, right? And see, is it the case that we're getting more and more random kind of junk data just with apps and devices and services that have nothing related to those sorts of data?
I think that's a very fair point. And I really liked, I think, the point you made earlier, although I'm not sure if I'm quoting you in those exact words, but the fact that we can does not perhaps mean that we have to. When coming back to kind of both data collection and the kind of thinking about design more broadly. And I think that's the gray area as well, kind of how to really regulate that. Because I'm increasingly unsure whether law will deliver answers to those gray areas. I think to some perhaps, but
so there is kind of one idea I am interested in perhaps pursuing in the future, and it's something I read from sort of like project management and like development literature. And there's this idea of like optimal ignorance of, we are faced with data overload, right? Information overload. There's too much stuff. A lot of it is not necessary or even useful to consider. But, what is the optimal level of you have what you want, what you need, and everything else is either diminishing returns or can then turn around and negatively impact your behavior, your decision-making processes, and so on. So I think that might be something interesting and promising to pursue in terms of, datafication. And there is sort of a related concept in information science called deliberate ignorance, where, you might be aware of certain types of information that exists, but you choose for whatever reason not to access it, not to know about it. And, putting those two together, I think might be an interesting, perhaps useful way forward. And maybe there are some regulatory or policy, ways to try to promote that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Yimin. I think that brings our seminar to an end. It was a fascinating talk, and I'm so delighted that you were able to deliver it today. not least in the middle of heat wave. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to everyone who joined online, and thank you for your questions. We wish you all the best with next steps for this research, and hopefully you'll come back and share with us the next steps as they unveil. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.